Hey, Fiveable. Good morning to me and good evening to all of you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in to our live stream for AP World History Modern tonight. Our topic today is going to be on religion and empire, and we're going to cover the time period 1450 to 1750. In our live stream today, I'm going to kind of break things down for us into some manageable pieces. This whole live stream tonight is going to be about religion and empire. It's not just solely about religion. It's going to be about how empires utilize religion. How do they use religion to govern? How do they use religion to unify? Or how do they use religion, even in some cases, to divide? And so we're using that kind of interconnection between religion and empire. And so we're going to go over some terms to know. Some of the terms are really going to be more about government-based. And then we're going to talk about empire building from 1450 to 1750 and the role of religion in different empires. So we're going to be looking at different empires around the world that existed during 1450 to 1750 and how those specific empires used religion to govern. And then, like I said, at the end, we're going to be doing some practice questions. So make sure you stick around to the end. I know that's what we like to do to kind of wrap up and get some more practice. So we'll have a few multiple choice questions, and then we're also going to have a long essay question prompt. We're not going to write a whole long essay question, but you can see a prompt of how it would be used, kind of the language that could be framed in a long essay question for this topic. Now, before I move forward, I just want to kind of give a little caveat, little heads up that we're not going to be talking about the development of these religions in this live stream. We're not going to talk about, the founding of Islam or even the spread of Buddhism. Those are topics that in a lot of cases were cut from the AP World History Modern curriculum. So like the development of Christianity and the interconnection of early empires and religion. A lot of that information was cut from AP World History Modern because we're starting in 1200. So these religions, most of them are really already developed and already have kind of home bases. In this case, we're not talking about the specifics of those religions or what they practice or what they believe. I would, if you don't know any of these religions, I would go back and kind of look into that, but that is information that won't be specifically tested on because it was cut from the AP World History Modern curriculum. So it is a little confusing. We're just kind of throwing you in at religions and how empires use them without the background. And that's how the course is just kind of set up now since they cut all of that information from the curriculum. So if you're super duper confused, sound off, ask me in comments, ask questions, and I will try to answer those as best as I can. So again, the development of the religions, the practices we're not really talking about or touching on. We're more focusing on the government side of it, and then kind of reverse how the government impacted society, impacted culture that direction. So let's get into some of the content. Before we kind of jump into 1450 to 1750, I want to talk about terms you should know. And I'm emphasizing should, because these are terms that you have probably seen in your books or in your notes or other live streams. And they're probably not defined terms. You're just supposed to assume that you know these terms. And so these are terms you should know, but are probably too afraid to ask at this point. So some of these terms, you may be like, Miss Thiessen, like that's an easy term, but others will be like, I kind of knew what that term was, but I really didn't. And I get that with my students a lot. They're like, what exactly do you mean by that? But they're a little embarrassed to ask. So the first one is administration. And this one you'll see in maybe you'll see it in long essay question prompts or short answer question prompts, and students will assume they know, like, I know I've seen that word my entire life. Maybe I should know what it is, but they're kind of guessing what it is. When we're talking about administration, we're talking about leadership, and we're talking about who the leaders are and how they create and enforce rules and laws. And that's really kind of a generic term. You can have administration within your school. And maybe you've heard that term before at your school, like our school administration is doing this. And you kind of assume you know what that means. But in a school, who are the administrators? They're the principal, the assistant principal. If you have a dean of students, if you have like an activities or athletic director, that's the administration. Those are the head honchos. So that's the leadership. Those are the people that are creating and enforcing the laws. And so in a government, those would be kind of the really the entire government could fit into this administration depending on what you're talking about. But really it's about a group of people that are in power, that have the power to create laws and rules, put them into practice, and then enforce them. What that means is when people break the law, they have the ability to throw them in jail or to kill them or do whatever. Our next term is bureaucracy. And this again kind of is like administration. The people see this word and they know they've heard it before, but they don't exactly know what it is. And this one, students ask me every single year, what do you mean by bureaucracy? Bureaucracy can be kind of interchangeable with government. A lot of times people will say like government bureaucracy, but with bureaucracy, we're talking about like the different levels in government that have different functions. So when we're talking about governments can be really, really big. And like United States government, it's a huge government, and we have the federal government, we have state governments, we have local level governments. And then within that, we have all of these other kind of like departments and a lot of people that work in the government. And so that is the bureaucracy, all of the various levels of government. And it includes elected officials, people that we maybe vote into that position of power, and appointed positions. And so all of those different levels of government are the bureaucracy. The next term is a really important one for our topic tonight, which is theocracy. So in a theocracy, it's a government where the government and the religion are so intertwined and enmeshed together that there really is no difference. In the United States, we hear that term, the phrase separation of church and state. You've probably heard that before. In a theocracy, there is no separation of church or whatever religion and state, whatever government there is. They are one and the same. And so in a theocracy, we may have religious leaders that are our government leaders. In a theocracy, we may be using religious law as our government's law, kind of the law of the land. And so it's completely intertwined. Religion and government are one and the same. There's no difference between them. And then this word I'm going to use a lot in this live stream. Sometimes you'll see this kind of throughout units 3 and 4 because we're talking about legitimate governments. And we're also going to be using it in a different way. We're going to be talking about how governments try to legitimize their rule. And so that one you will hear in other live streams as well. And you're probably wondering, what does that word mean, legitimize? Legitimize comes from legitimate. And you guys are way too young to know the song Too Legit to Quit. Maybe you know it. Too legit to quit. Okay. Anyways, there was a hand motion with that song. I mean, gotta love it. So to be legitimate, the government that's in power is recognized by the people as being in control. That means that they understand that that government has power, and they give that power to the government to kind of govern over them. They see them that they are in control. That government I recognize as being my government, and I'm going to accept the laws that they bring down and the enforcement that they have for breaking those laws. In this time period, 1450 to 1750, and even in the time period before 1200 to 1450, we have a lot of changes in government. And so let's say that one government is overthrown by a new government. Well, the people, I mean, it's not like we have Twitter or anything at that time. We don't have the constant news that we know. We now, as everyday people, are wondering who's in power. Am I going to listen to this new government, Or should I listen to the old government that's now been thrown out of power? And these new governments try to find ways to legitimize their rule, making their rule be the one that people are going to follow. And they do this in many different ways. They show their power. They show enforcement to their laws. Maybe they show military strength. Maybe they unify the people under their new government. And so when we have especially these changes of government, governments try to legitimize their rule, to try to make their rule legitimate in their country so that people will follow them and follow the laws that they put out. And so that word, again, you'll see in this live stream, you'll probably see in some other live streams as we talk about units 3 and 4 with government. So I've been using that units 3 and 4. You're probably wondering where this lesson will fall mostly on religion and empire. And our live stream tonight is going to be on unit 3. In AP World History Modern, like I said before, we're kind of divided in our time periods by units. So our time period is 1450 to 1750. And in 1450 to 1750, our class has 2 different units. The first unit in this time period is unit 3, and it's on land-based empires. Unit 4 is transoceanic interconnections. And I'm going to kind of throw a little bit in there in this lesson about overseas empires because it's going on at the same time period. But our big focus is on our topic 3.3. It's kind of how we subdivide the units. I mean, talking about bureaucracy with all the levels in the government. If this was a bureaucracy for AP World History Modern, this would be all of our levels in our class. And so topic 3.3 is about empires, land-based empires, and their belief systems. So that's where this lesson is going to fall in the grand scheme of things for the AP World History Modern class. So unit 3, land-based empires, we're talking about those empires that are not overseas empires. So we're not talking about those empires that have expanded into the Americas or into sub-Saharan Africa or into Southeast Asia by water. We're talking about empires that are connected over land. And this has been the traditional, up to this point, 1450 way that empires existed. They were by land because we had these empires that expanded mostly by cavalry and infantry troops that are on the ground, and they're connecting large swaths of land into one central administration. And so that's been really the traditional organization structure. But as we know, in 1450, when we start having this huge push of overseas voyaging with these, especially Western Europeans, claiming lands across the oceans, we start to see that shift. So again, this is 1450 to 1750. We're in land-based empires, and we're going to be talking about how those empires use belief systems to administer their empires. So what does that look like? In 1450 to 1750, we have land-based empires and overseas empires that are expanding. And how do they expand? Well, most of the time we're expanding because we have strong militaries. But when you're an empire, kind of the basic definition of an empire is you're ruling over other dissimilar people. So you're ruling over people that may not practice the same religion that you do. They may have different languages. They may have other different belief systems. They may have a different social structure. And as a government, how are you going to take over those lands and then maintain your control over them? They want to, using that term I just introduced to you, they want to legitimize their rule. If they expand into a new area, they want to make sure that those people are going to follow them, that they're not going to rebel, that they're going to kind of come into this empire and be unified in their empire. They want to centralize their authority. What that means is with the central government, they want to make sure that they're maintaining control in one area, maybe out of a capital city, and in the rule of one, maybe king or sultan in that capital city. And then however big their empire is, no matter where you go in that empire, it's all under that central control. And they want people to kind of fall in line. They want people to be brought into this empire and not give them a hard time, not to rebel, to be unified, and to follow the laws that they are putting forth in those new areas. And they have a lot of different methods that they do use to try to legitimize their rule over these new subject people. They're going to maybe use displays of wealth. They're going to use displays of their power and of their rule in these new areas, so that when people look at the empire, they think, wow, that empire is a force to be reckoned with. We have no chance if we're going to try to rebel, that we're going to be, of course, we're going to be crushed if we try to go against this strong empire. We see them kind of put them up on a pedestal. And they may try to unify their people through language. And we even saw this, with early empires using central language, using a language of the empire, so that all of the bureaucrats, all of those levels of government can communicate with early each other. And we saw that early, even our ancient empires did that. We may be using new script or written language that we can use throughout the whole empire that unifies them. We may be using art, and people are thinking, well, art, how's that showing power? But when we're using things like art and we're using architecture, we can use this to display our vast amounts of wealth. And countries that are wealthy, how do they get that wealth? They get that wealth through taxes. But if we're a government, we may think that taxes are kind of like an easy thing to do, but enforcing taxation shows government power, because if you don't pay your taxes, the government's going to deal with you. And if that government has power in order to enforce those laws and enforce taxation, that's demonstrating their power, then they're going to use that taxation, use that money that's coming in, and they could be putting it into displays of public art or displays of monumental architecture. They may be building temples or churches or palaces that's displaying how much wealth they have. And then they're filling those temples or churches or palaces with art, with gilding, with marble. And we're seeing all of that wealth kind of used in that way. And it does show this dramatic amount of wealth and power that the government does have. And of course, which brings us to our lesson today. We're like, geesh, Thiessen, get into it, is religion. We can use religion to unify. As we get into the next time period, when we get into the kind of the 1700s, we're going to start talking about nationalism. But really, nationalism is creating a sense of unity of culture. And when we talk about that in this time period, we're really talking about religion. That's one of the ways that governments use to unify their people. They may be tolerant of various religions, and that creates a sense of nationalism, because you have the ability to practice the way that you want, and you see that government as being kind of open to your religion and allows you to practice in the way that you want. But other governments use religion, maybe they enforce people to convert to one religion because they want people to be homogenous. They want one religion within their empire. So let's kind of get a good overview of this. Here's a huge chart. I would screenshot this. I would take a picture of this, because this is a great overview chart for empires 1450 to 1750. And I kind of divided it by region. And then when we get into the notes, it's kind of by region as well. So here's our major empires. This is not an inclusive list, but these are our major empires and some of the ones I'm going to be talking about today. Their ideologies that they practice. In these cases, some are going to have a official religion, meaning that that government is going to promote one specific religion in that empire, but there may be very diverse religions practiced within that empire as well. And then some of these key developments. These are things that are going on in that region during this time period, 1450 to 1750. And a lot of times we do see this interaction with these developments that change or shape how the empires govern or administer their empires. So I'm not going to get too much into all the information here, but this is something great to screenshot and take a picture of, to save and come back and see that. So that is our kind of good overview for 1450 to 1750 with our empires. So let's start where AP World History Modern seems to love, and that's European history. Any of you guys take or have taken, let me know in comments if you have taken AP European history. I'm very curious. AP European history, this is probably one of the funnest topics to cover on divine right monarchies, because it is just such elaborate displays of wealth and privilege. And so in this picture here, you can see really the demonstration of these European divine right monarchies. Does anybody know who this person is on horseback getting crowned by an angel in this picture? I know it's kind of small because I'm going to have a lot of notes that cover it. But let me know in comments if you know who this king is. I'm giving you it's a king because you see the long hair. You're probably thinking, who is this? King or queen? This is a king. Let me know in comments if you know who it is. So in Western Europe, 1450 is kind of marking a new period of centralized authority in Western Europe. Western Europe previously, our previous time period was very decentralized. We had feudalism, and those kind of feudal lords had power just over specific regions. We had these kinds of loose governments that didn't really centralize authority like the Holy Roman Empire. But when we get to 1450, we start to see these empires centralize, and these kings assert their authority over their nobility, over these previous feudal lords, and they're starting to tax. They're starting to build up militaries, and they want to legitimize their rule. Why should these people who had been following a feudal lord for so long now follow this new person who maybe lives really far away that I've never met before? Why should I pay taxes to him? Why should I follow that new government? And so they want to legitimize their rule. And one way that they did this was through what's called divine right. And this is a term that is not really unique to Europe. Divine right really means that God or a God has divinely appointed you to rule, that you have been chosen specifically as you are king or queen to rule over these people. And what that really does is that it gives the ruler power to not have to listen to anybody else. Because if you say, like, who died made you king? Well, God made me king. So you can't, question my authority, because guess what? If you question my authority, you're questioning God. And if you're a good Christian in Western Europe, you're not going to question God. And so I don't have to, as king, have to listen to you. I only have to answer to God, because you didn't make me king. God made me king. And so we don't really have a lot of checks on the government's powers, because they believe that they have the right to rule from God and that they don't have to listen to anybody else. And so it kind of elevates not only the role of the king, it kind of makes them like a divine figure in themselves. And you see these depictions like in this picture here, this portrait. And if you don't know who it is, it's Louis XIV of France. And you see he's being crowned by an angel, not crowned by the people, crowned by an angel. But it also provides kind of an interesting interplay between the role of the clergy or the priesthood and the government. Because if you say that you get your power from God, and then the priests are like, God didn't appoint you as power, then you kind of have them at odds. But instead, these divine right monarchs in Western Europe are going to elevate the role of the clergy, of the priesthood. And it's kind of, I scratch your back if you scratch mine. It's kind of quid pro quo. Oh, I can't even say that word. Quid pro quo, where the priesthood, the clergy is going to say like, oh yes, God has appointed you to rule. Absolutely. God, has told me as his, appointee on earth that yes, that king is appointed by God. And then in exchange, the church maybe has lots of land. Maybe they don't pay taxes on that land, and the clergy may have an elevated position in society. And so in these European divine right monarchies, we have a lot. There's quite a few Western European states that are claiming this divine right. And really two good examples that we're going to use are France and Spain. Now, France, under previous kings, Louis XIV is going to be kind of like the main turning point of setting up this divine right monarchy within France. We're going to see how that ends up in the French Revolution. But previously, they tried to have religious toleration, which was passed in a law known as the Edict of Nantes. And the Edict of Nantes granted religious toleration to the Protestants of France called the Huguenots. And religious toleration means that they were able to practice the way that they want to. They can practice and go to Protestant churches. They don't have to follow Catholic law or recognize Catholic holidays, etc. They can practice how they wished. But under Louis XIV, who wants to legitimize his rule, wants to centralize his authority, is going to revoke or take away that Edict of Nantes and take away that religious toleration of the French Protestants or the Huguenots. And that's going to cause some to be emigres and to leave France. It's going to really hurt, and in the long run, the French economy. Spain as well is, I would argue, exceptionally religious. In 1492 is a big year for Spain. Not only did they become patrons of Christopher Columbus's overseas explorations, but they're also launching this Reconquista, or the reconquering of the Iberian Peninsula, which is where Spain sits. And they're going to use religion almost like in a crusading sense, where they're going to use it to legitimize their rule and to unify their rule over a land, the Iberian Peninsula, which had been under, at times, Islamic rule. And they're going to use the Spanish Inquisition. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. If you don't know that skit, you have to look it up on YouTube. So they're going to try to enforce Catholicism in their lands. And they're going to really target particularly Jews and Muslims in these areas of Spain, to try to force them either to give up their religion and convert to Catholicism or expel those groups from Spain. But in this time period, 1450 to 1750, we have a huge change in religion in Western Europe, and that's with the Protestant Reformation. So the Protestant Reformation is going to challenge the Catholic Church authority throughout Western Europe. And it's going to create a break in the Christian world, but it also divides up Europe, because previously we had really just Roman Catholicism being practiced in Western Europe. But with the Protestant Reformation, there are going to be some areas that are going to become Protestant. And one area in particular is this region known as the Holy Roman Empire. It's kind of loosely governed area in Central Europe, including places like Germany. And in this Holy Roman Empire, we have different principalities or different regions that are different states. And some of them are going to use this as an opportunity to legitimize and to break away from the hold and the power of the Catholic Church and become Protestant, particularly in this region of Germany. These states, some of which are going to become Protestant, which is going to throw off that yoke of the Holy Roman Empire over them. And it's going to create a huge amount of chaos in Central Europe and into wars known as the 100 Years' War, which completely devastated Central Europe, almost wiped out portions of population, I think like by half. But it also created new political rivalries between those countries that are Catholic and those countries that are Protestant. One of my favorite rivalries, I shouldn't say I have a favorite rivalry, but I do, is between Spain and England. And here is a monarch. Sound off in comments if you know who this queen is, I'll let you know it's a queen. Who is this person in this picture? Spain, like I said before, was very Catholic, very staunchly devout, and very staunchly religious. But England, as we know, does break away from the Catholic Church with Henry VIII, declaring a new Protestant religion, which is the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. And this also creates a rivalry between Spain and England, in which Spain is going to try to invade England. And the Spanish Armada, which was rumored to be unbeatable, was defeated. And what really destroyed them the most was a storm off the coast of England. And famously, this monarch, if you don't know who it is Elizabeth I. And she had this quote that was kind of ended up becoming known as the term Protestant wins, that it wasn't really anything that the English did. It was the Protestant wins that destroyed the Spanish. And I always think that term is kind of funny. But it also created kind of a counter-reformation by the Catholic Church, or the Catholic Reformation, in which they're responding to these accusations that led to the different Protestant religions. And it also created new religious orders that are going to have missionizing efforts, and new orders like the Society of Jesus or the Jesuits, that are going to become missionaries. As we see with this overseas colonization, we're going to start to spread these missionizing efforts to the Americas, to Africa, and to Asia. And so this is going to have some long-lasting effects, as well as these far-reaching areas are going to be seeing Christian and Catholic missionaries and spreading Christianity to these areas where Christianity was not practiced previously. All right, let's get out of Europe. Let's go over to Africa, to West Africa, with the Songhai Empire. And you may see this spelled two different ways. Both ways are fine. You may see it spelled with a Y or an I. Now, this area, if you learned from our previous lessons about trans-Saharan trade, you know that Islam did come to West Africa by those trans-Saharan trade routes. And places like Mali and West Africa are going to convert to Islam with the goal of kind of promoting trade. So they're using this as an empire to kind of entice more trade into their area. Because if you entice trade into your area, you're going to entice money to come in. You're going to entice more people to have jobs. You're going to entice lots of wealth that you can then in turn put that back into your country to legitimize your rule. Remember, displaying wealth in art or in architecture. But a lot of the converts to Islam are really just going to remain in the upper classes. In Songhai, the Songhai Empire, which is going to supersede or surpass the Mali Empire in West Africa in this time period, 1450 to 1750, we're not really seeing huge converts coming from the lower classes to Islam. It's really going to just remain among the upper class elites. But the government, the Songhai government, and those upper class elites who are in these positions of authority are going to use Islam to promote not just trade into their area, but they're also going to build monumental architecture. They're going to use that wealth from trade in displays of Islamic architecture like mosques. But lower classes in the Songhai region of West Africa are still going to practice traditional African religions. They're going to, in a lot of cases, start to blend practices where maybe we have Islamic laws that we're using and practicing, but our day-to-day religion is still our traditional African religions. And we start to see this, what's called syncretism, or this blending of religion in West Africa. But in the Songhai Empire, they are going to use religion to govern, because again, that's our topic here, religion to govern. And how they do that is because those upper class elites, the bureaucracy, and the emperors of the Songhai Empire are all converts to Islam. They're going to use Islamic law or Sharia law and Islamic judges, qadis, that are going to enforce the laws in those areas. So even though a lot of the vast majority of the people of the Songhai region are not Muslim, they are going to be bound by Islamic law because it's the law of the land. And so in this case, the Songhai Empire can be seen as a theocracy, but it's really kind of loose enforcement of conversions. And like I said before, they're trying to legitimize their rule. So in some cases, we're kind of seeing that crossover. They're using that wealth from the trade, kind of their initial draw to Islam, and they're going to use that wealth and they're going to build monumental architecture like this mosque here that's pictured of Timbuktu. They're also going to build madrasas or Islamic schools of learning. Places like Timbuktu are going to be kind of centers of Islamic scholarship in the region, which is going to draw people from all around the world. Now let's go and talk about China. When we talk about China at this time period, we're not necessarily talking about religion to govern, but we're also talking about ideology to govern. And in China, they use Confucian ideology to govern. And this is not new. They've been doing this for centuries now at this point. But our two empires in China at this point are the Ming and the Qing dynasty. Now, the Ming dynasty early on was kind of interested in exploration. They send out Songhai into the Indian Ocean, but then they retract on that. And they are overthrown eventually by the Manchu, who set up the Qing Empire. Even though the Qing are Manchu and they're a different culture from the Han Chinese culture, they're also going to use Confucianism as the ideology, kind of the law of the land. Even though they suppressed many Han Chinese cultural traditions, they're going to adopt Confucian policies and principles to govern, kind of helps legitimize their authority. They're also going to, both the Ming and Qing dynasty, going to use the imperial examinations in order to get more bureaucrats to help govern their ever-expanding empire. And really the cornerstone of the imperial examinations is Confucian ideology and Confucian scholarship. But this is a time of flux in 1450, 1750, new changes. And we're going to see the arrival of Christian missionaries into China. And at some points, I say it's met with both resistance and acceptance, because there are some points in some times in history where they do accept Christian missionaries. And one good example is pictured here. The Jesuit Matteo Ricci kind of becomes this intermediary between the Christian world, the West, and China. But in other times, other leaders are going to resist the Christian missionaries, sometimes expelling them, sometimes putting them under close supervision, or really not allowing them to use their missionizing efforts in China. So it's kind of met both ways. And this is important because, as we're seeing in this time period, East Asia, with the arrival of Christian missionaries, it does kind of throw a wrench into the system of these old empires, and how they're dealing with the arrival of new religions is going to be a problem that they're going to have to figure out. Now let's go to the gunpowder empires. Gunpowder empires, though gunpowder was not invented in these areas, did come to these areas and was so important to the growth of these empires. Safavid Persia, Mughal India, and the Ottoman Empire. And the first one we're going to talk about is kind of the outlier of the other two. It's the Safavid Empire of Persia. And this area of the world is going to be different than our other two gunpowder empires, which also rule over these areas of the Middle East, Southwest Asia, because the Safavid were Shia Muslim. And the Shia Muslims are going to be at odds during this time period with their Sunni neighbors. Even though these three gunpowder empires are all Muslim, it's going to kind of emphasize that division between Shia and Sunni that had already existed previously. And it's going to create political rivalries with their two neighbors, the Ottoman Empire and the, that should also include the Mughal Empire of India as well, because we're seeing these divisions between them. But it's emphasizing the divisions between Shia and Sunni. And the Safavids launch a vigorous campaign to try to convert their people to Shia Islam. And they're going to use enforced conversion, meaning that they're going to force you to convert to Shia Islam, trying to kind of eliminate the Sunni Muslims in that region. The Sunni ulama, the councils, are going to be in some areas kind of eradicated, wiped out, sometimes killed, or evicted from Persia. They're going to try to create this kind of sense of unification under Shia Islam by using Sharia law and using the Shia religion. They're going to really enforce this unification. Foreign or Sunni shrines, even Sufis were banned. Other religions were really eradicated and kind of created the sense of homogenous culture within Persia that had previously had lots of different religions that had practiced there. Speaking of diversity, India is a very rich, diverse tapestry of cultures and religions. But the empire that ruled them, stemming from this northerly point, is the Mughal dynasty, and they are Muslim. And at this time, we're going to see kind of the vast majority of Mughal emperors use Islam to govern and kind of try to crack down on the Hindu majority and the other diverse religions of the area. But our outlier, our exception, is the ruler Akbar. Mughal Emperor Akbar is kind of the outlier because he was incredibly religiously tolerant. And not only did he allow for the free practice of religions, he eliminated the jizya, the religious tax on Hindus. And he went even further by, here's a picture here where he's meeting with different religious leaders who was incredibly open-minded to religion. And he even supported the creation of a syncretic or blended religion, which he called the religion of God, which was mostly a syncretic religion of Hinduism, which the vast majority of people in India practiced, and Islam, which was the religion of the Mughals who invaded into this region. But this religion of God also included aspects of Christianity, Jainism, and Zoroastrianism. So he was, again, Akbar was really the outlier with this religious toleration. We also in 1450 to 1750 see other syncretic religions like Sikhism coming in, which is also kind of a blend of Hinduism and Islam. But these other Mughal emperors are going to use Islam to govern, and they were not religiously tolerant. So again, Akbar is the outlier. He is the exception and not the rule of religious toleration in India. And because these Mughal empires are going to emphasize Islam, some are going to be extremists, like Aurangzeb. The late Emperor Aurangzeb is kind of the last in our line of Mughal emperors, cracked down on other religions. He destroyed Hindu temples. He really tried to eradicate other religions and enforce conversions to Islam. Others are just going to not be as extreme as that. So we're kind of a pendulum of extremes under Mughal emperors. But they're also going to use this tax on Hindus called the jizya. This tax, in a lot of cases, was extreme. Basically, you could practice your religion, but you have to be taxed this additional tax. And they continue in a lot of cases to raise this tax. So it's almost an unbearable tax to kind of force you economically to convert to Islam. The Ottoman Empire, which is across North Africa, parts of the Arabian Peninsula, and into even parts of Eastern Europe around the Mediterranean, is also a Sunni Muslim empire. But the Ottoman Empire is quite diverse as well, especially as they expand. As they expand into areas like Eastern Europe, they're going to encounter more non-Muslims, and they're going to have to figure out how to deal with that. In their central authority, they have the rule of the Sultan. In the Safavid Empire of Persia, they have a religious leader that is called the Shah. And in Safavid Persia, it's a theocracy. So that role of the Shah is a religious leader as well. Here, the sultans are more of a government leader, but they're also claiming authority as kind of the head of the church, or the head, the caliph of Islam, as a kind of a caliphate that we had seen in the previous time periods. And so this early expansion, as the Ottoman Empire is expanding into Eastern Europe in particular, we do see some kind of religious aspects to that expansion. And they try to use Islam kind of as a crusading factor into these areas by launching a jihad, or a religious war struggle across North Africa and into Eastern Europe to conquer these areas. And with their gunpowder technology, it allowed them to take these areas. They also have an elite guard of janissaries, which was created through the Div Shurma program. Now, let me kind of explain the Div Shurma. What this does is, in non-Muslim areas of the empire, this Div Shurma system forced people to give up their children as kind of a taxation. Now that sounds kind of crazy, but we've had like forced labor taxes in other parts of the world. This was to give up their young Christian boys to the state, and these boys would be converted to Islam. They would be educated and trained. Some of them could become the elite guards or janissaries. And in these areas, particularly the areas of the Balkans, which were mostly Christian communities, they had to surrender up to like 20% of their male children up to the state, which is kind of extreme in a lot of cases. But as they expand and through time, the Ottomans are going to, as we know, start to lose a lot of their centralized authority as they grow. And so in some of these areas, like in Eastern Europe, they're going to adopt what's called a millet system. And what this means is that these non-Muslim communities are organized into like smaller cultural communities, like religious or ethnic communities or geographic communities, where they have some local power and some ability to practice their religions as they choose. But again, that Div Shurma program really did target non-Muslim communities, and it helped the empire grow and build their military and build their bureaucracy, because those young Christian boys would be converted to Islam and then brought into the government system. Now let's go over to the Americas. I'm kind of hustling up because I want to make sure we have enough time to cover our practice questions. In the Americas, we're going to kind of focus on the Aztecs. The Incas would be a great example for this as well. I'm not super inclusive, sorry, in this of every empire that I'm talking about at this time period. But the Aztecs are a really good example of using religion to govern. The Aztecs are polytheistic. And in their religion, they have many specific rituals that they have to carry out that coincide with a very elaborate religious calendar. And these rituals are so important because it ensures the survival of their empire and their survival of their world. And the Aztec priests are paramount to these rituals because they carry out the rituals. And so because these rituals are of utmost importance to the continuity of their livelihood, the priests have an elevated position in society as well. So we're kind of seeing, even across the ocean, how the role about those religions are similar, and how priests can have an elevated position because religion is elevated in importance. And their governments, their cities are even centralized around the temples, not around, elaborate palaces like we see, in some areas, but these are around temples because religion is so central to their everyday life, and the calendar and the rituals are central to their everyday life. So these cities were really built around the temples as the central focal points in the cities. And here in these temples, most of these rituals involve some type of bloodletting or human sacrifice, kind of a sacrifice to their gods, so that their gods can continue to provide food with a bountiful harvest, or to continue the continuity of their world, of the seasons. And so the religion was really intertwined within their government, and even with their expansion, it was intertwined as well, because the areas that they governed, they used a tributary system. And part of the tribute that had to be paid by conquered people included captives, prisoners of war that were given for these Aztec rituals. And as they expanded, the Aztecs would not kill on the battlefield. They would kill if they had to. Their goal was to take captives so that they could bring them back for these rituals. They thought, killing somebody on the battlefield was kind of wasted blood when it could be given to a god instead. And like in other parts of the world, remember, the Aztecs were isolated from Afro-Eurasia, but we still see some similarities, because the Aztec emperor was also a divine right emperor. He was viewed as divinely appointed, in a lot of cases seen as almost godlike. So a lot of this we talked about places where we're unifying religions, or places where we're having the religion of the majority. But what do these empires do with people of different religions? They have several options. The first one is toleration. You can allow people to practice their religions however they choose. And in some areas, we can see with the example of dhimmi status in Muslim countries. This dhimmi status means that it's given to really means a protected person, referring to, under Sharia law, people of the book, particular Jews and Christians, but also can be used for other religions like Zoroastrians and Hindus and Buddhists and Jains, giving them a protected status, and that they could continue to practice whatever religion they choose, sometimes, as long as they pay that jizya, or that extra tax. Another option is by enforcing conversions to your religion, like we saw in the Safavid Empire of Persia, where they forced people to convert to Shia Islam. And they can be persecuted, basically be put in the court systems, thrown into prison, to try to not enforce conversions, but to try to basically give them no other options. And sometimes they would not so voluntarily flee because of this religious persecution. Like the example of those Huguenots, those French Protestants. The persecution, by ending that religious toleration, basically gave Huguenots really no other choice. They were either going to continue to be persecuted in France, or they could leave. They could flee and become immigrants to other countries. Or in some cases, they could be forced out of the country. They could face expulsion. The Jews and the Moriscos in Spain are a good example of this. After that reconquista of Spain, they basically forced the Moriscos, the Muslims, out of Spain. This image here is depicting that expulsion of the Moriscos. Now, this is not so much our topic 3.3, but since it's at this time period, just want to throw this in there. We are seeing the spread of religions, because we're seeing the spread of the growth of these overseas empires. And a lot of these overseas empires are Christian. And so, of course, we're going to see the spread of Christianity into these areas of the Americas, Sub-Saharan Africa in particular, and East Asia, with the arrival of missionary efforts. And some are going to force conversion to Christianity. Some are going to, again, as we see, persecute those people that practice different religions. With these new missionary efforts, I put this in the earlier slide about the Protestant Reformation. New religious orders like the Jesuits, the Dominicans, and the Franciscans have a missionizing effort. They want to go and convert non-Christians to Christianity. And in some cases, we see backlash to this missionizing efforts. Japan is a good example where they were open to trade from the rest of East Asia. They closed off their ports to these Christian missionaries. And because with the arrival of new religions, coupled with the practice of old religions, we see more syncretism, more cultural or religious blending of religions. Maybe they adopt some practices, but still retain a lot of the daily practices of traditional religions. Wow, I went fast at the end. I'm so sorry. Let's get to practice questions. Woo! Okay, in comments, you're going to guess. We have 4 multiple choice questions. In comments, you're going to guess your answer. So here we go. Question number 1. Here we have a map. And it says from 1300 to 1703, gunpowder empires dominated parts of Europe, Africa, and Asia. Here we have them. I'd already talked about them. How did the Safavid Empire's religion and geographic location contribute to its identity? A, its central location helped it dominate and convert the Ottomans and Mughals. B, being sandwiched between 2 rival empires likely heightened its Shia identity. C, trade with Europe helped build a sense of cosmopolitan religious tolerance. Or D, neighboring India caused tremendous conflict between Muslims and Hindus. So answer in comments is number 1, A, B, C, or D. Answer to number 1 is B. Being sandwiched between 2 rival empires likely heightened its Shia identity. Next one, we have a big excerpt. I'm going to speed read it. You ready? This is an excerpt from the Edict of Fontainebleau by Louis XIV of France. I be it known that for these causes and others, us hereunto moving in of our certain knowledge, full power, and royal authority, we have by this present perpetual and irrevocable edict suppressed and revoked, and do suppress and revoke the edict of our said grandfather given at Nantes. We forbid our subjects of the RPR to meet any more for the exercise of the said religion in any place or private house, under any pretext whatever. We likewise forbid all noblemen of what condition soever to hold such religious exercises in their houses or fiefs, under penalty to be inflicted upon all our said subjects who shall engage in the said exercises of imprisonment and confiscation. We can join all ministers of the said RPR who do not choose to become converts and to embrace the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion to leave our kingdom and the territory subject to us within a fortnight of the publication of our present edict. Question number 2, why does Louis believe he has the authority to decide the religion of his subjects? A, because of the Constitution of France. B, because he made the law in consultation with the Estates General of France. C, because of the divine right theory of absolutism. D, because of the danger of the Reformation has passed. A, B, C, or D, number 2. Answer number 2 is C. So, and I said before that he revoked the Edict of Nantes, which granted religious toleration. He's taking away that religious toleration here in the Edict of Fontainebleau. Number 3, you got another pick. That means I'll have to read. Woot. The painting above by Mexican artist Sebastian Salcedo entitled Virgin of Guadalupe is an example of which of the following religious developments of the period between 1450 and 1750? A, cultural diffusion of new forms of Christianity after the Protestant Reformation. B, syncretic religions which emerged in the maritime empires of Europe. C, iconoclastic destruction of idols amongst native peoples in the Americas. Or D, resistance by traditional religious authorities against new scientific discoveries. Number 3, answer A, B, C, or D. Number 3, B, syncretic religions which emerged in the maritime empires of Europe. Last multiple choice. Here we go, number 4. Here is an excerpt. This is from the memoirs of a courtier of the Mughal Emperor Akbar the Great. Remember, he was the outlier for us. And later that day, the emperor came to Fatehpur. There he used to spend much time in the hall of worship in the company of learned men and sheikhs, and especially on Friday nights, when he would sit up there the whole night, continually occupied in discussion questions of religion. Learned monks also from Europe, who are called Padre, brought the gospel and advanced proofs for the Trinity. His Majesty firmly believed in the truth of the Christian religion, and wishing to spread the doctrines of Jesus, he ordered Prince Murad to take a few lessons in Christianity. His Majesty also called some of the yogis, Hindu holy men, and gave them the night private interviews, inquiring into abstract truths. Number 4, what may have contributed to Akbar's views on religion? A, his background of being raised by Buddhist monks. B, the rich diversity of religious beliefs and practices found around his empire. C, the terrible religious violence he witnessed during his visit to Europe. Or D, India's long history of being free from violence and conquest. Answer number 4, A, B, C, or D. Number 4 is B. The rich diversity of religious beliefs and practices found around his empire. Kind of giggled at letter D. Long history of being free from violence and conquest. Sure. All right, our last practice question is actually an LEQ question, which is your homework. I'm saying that as it's past midnight if you're on the East Coast, but this is a good practice question that kind of wraps up and uses the information that we had. So this is a practice LEQ question. It could also be kind of used as like a short answer question if it was briefer. And so this question asks, analyze similarities and differences of how land-based empires used religion to govern from 1450 to 1750. It actually is kind of modified from a previous test question that we had a few years ago, like 7 years ago, something like that, when we had the compare-contrast type LEQ questions. So in this type of question, it says analyze similarities and differences of how land-based empires used religion to govern. So you're going to kind of look at different religions or different empires and how they used religions to govern, and then make those comparisons across these empires. So you would say, like, while the Aztec Empire used sacrifices to display their power and continuity and legitimacy of their peoples, the Ottomans used, I'm just totally throwing this out, I should have prepared this, used the Dev Sharma program to enforce conversions. That was a horrible comparison. But do you see what I mean? We're going to be looking at different empires. This is how one used this aspect to govern. This is how another empire used this aspect to govern. And you're going to explain why they did it similar or different. So if we're looking at similarities, you could say like the Aztecs and Western Europe both had divine right monarchs, even though they had no contact yet at that point in the early 1450. You could explain how they used divine right to legitimize their rule. How did they use it in the Aztec Empire, and how did they use it in Western Europe? That was a much better example. Way to go, Miss Thiessen. All right, so here's our wrap up. Nailed it. Hopefully you know who that is. That's Martin Luther. Nailing 95 theses on the church door of Württemberg, Germany. Here we go. Takeaways. In this, remember that we're talking about religion to govern. So we're talking about legitimizing rule, but there's other ways they do that. So kind of make some comparisons with other ways that governments administer and control their empires. How do they legitimize their rule besides religion? Like I said when we started this, we're really not talking about the development of the religion or the arrival of the religion. So we can kind of look at previous time periods and how religion had developed up to that point where we're using in 1450 to 1750 that religion to govern. And then as we move forward, 1750 to 1900, let's start looking forward and backward about continuities and changes over time, connecting it to previous time periods as well as future time periods, but also think about it within this time period, 1450 to 1750. How did it during this time period change over time? Were they always doing one thing, or did they start adopting new practices? That's a good one to do for Mughal India, because Akbar is the outlier. So that marks a change because later descendants of Akbar are not going to be as religiously tolerant. So that's a change over time within that time period, 1450 to 1750. So again, keep branching out when we're talking about empires and we're talking about administration. Think about culture, think about society, think about wealth and trade and how they're using all of these things to govern. Make those cross-cultural connections between empires, make those connections over time as well. Thank you guys so much for joining me. Make sure you follow us on all of our platforms. We are at Thinkfiveable, and I am at Miss Thiessen. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm so happy to have you guys join me today. Hope you guys have a good night's rest, and we'll see you next time here at Fiveable.